Hello, this tutorial will be covering how to assign specific wall types to partitions in Revit, and then also how to color code them and create an appropriate legend. I'll also cover curtain walls briefly to allow you to create glazed storefronts. So let's get started. First things first, if you're working in a file where you might have design options, defining wall types is a step that you do once you've selected an option. Very rarely we'll do this while we're still in the space planning stages. So assuming that you selected your design option, make sure you go to the Manage and Design Options, and then Accept Primary, which will delete all of the other option sets. You can see all of the views of alternates are getting deleted. So now we have only one space plan left in this file. Again, make sure you do this first so you can select everything in your working view. Now let's get started. At this point in time, you should have already assigned your wall types in a paper markup, so you know what you're building and you're not figuring it out as you're going along. That said, you can make some adjustments while you're working on it in Revit, of course. So I'll get started with, this is an office exterior wall type. So this in my particular plan, because everything else is a conference room, is going to be my type 1. And if you were drawing this appropriately, you should have selected the generic 5-inch wall, which is the most typical thickness of the partition. And also at this point in time, look at the height. Think about your ceiling. If you're doing ceiling height, through ceiling height, so you should be thinking about defining heights of all of these walls. So what I'm going to do first is define all of my walls in this area as a certain height. So I no longer want things to go to the level up above. I'll make my walls unconnected, and then assuming a 10-foot height for my ceiling, I'll make my unconnected height 10 feet, and that will make all the wall ceiling height unless I know them otherwise later on when I can adjust the heights individually. So starting with this partition, I'm going to edit the type and duplicate, since I do want this to be my basis. And I'm just calling it type 1. Now define the structural of your wall. So we have 3 and 5/8 inch steel stud, 5/8 of an inch jib board each side, and batt insulation. Now I'm using slightly shortcutted expressions, so jib board, you can see shortened, steel can be shortened, batt instead of acoustic batt insulation, and then I'm going to call this ceiling height. So now this is my type 1, and you can see the complete name. Let's go and define the structure of this wall. Also, I want to make sure that the function of it is interior. This does not necessarily affect things very much if you're just doing an interior project, but it's nice to have things noted correctly. So going to edit the structure, right now you just have a generic exterior structure that's 5 inches. So first let's start by defining that structure as steel stud. So in your material library, you can have metal stud layer. Material is just very generic here. And adjust the thickness to 3 and 5/8. And this is a structural material. Now we need to add some gypsum board, so I inserted a layer, and I'm taking it out of the core boundary because this is a finish layer. And now I'm going to find some gypsum board. So there's interior gypsum board and interior ceiling gypsum board. Now the difference is, and the one of the gypsum board will have the pattern, and the other gypsum board will have a slightly different pattern for the ceiling. Now, one thing to make sure is that the ceiling one has a pattern, whether it's on a ceiling or it's cut. The standard gypsum wall board does not have a surface pattern in elevations, and you don't want it to have a surface pattern in elevations. So it's fine to have a cut pattern but not a surface pattern, so this is the one you want to select. The reason we put a pattern on ceilings is to differentiate whether you have a gypsum board ceiling or you have no ceiling whatsoever, and there are different ways we can do that as well, where the exposed deck might have a different color. But for now, just make sure you realize that in Revit, this is how they're differentiated. Okay. It will save a lot of frustration later when you're setting up your elevations. So this is 5/8, and now I need to insert one more layer, and this one's going to go on the other side of the core boundary, and same finish. It will automatically default to the same finish, which makes this faster. Now if you look at this, the total thickness is actually 4 7/8. It's no longer 5 inches, depending on the layers that we define, and our gypsum board is going to wrap around the corners. So that is a good thing. We do want to keep it that way. Make sure your finishes are not structural material. And we'll select OK here. And the next step is assigning a core scale fill pattern. So this will assign the color coding to the wall. The fill pattern should be your solid fill, and then select colors. Just make sure that there is enough variety of the colors. So I'll start with the yellow wall. And now you can see this particular wall that I've defined is a yellow wall. Now let's look at defining some additional wall types. So first I'll go and define all of the wall types that I want to be of the type 1, just to get started. Okay, so all of these I'm making the type 1. And they're at the appropriate height because I'm making them ceiling height. Now let's say this wall is partially in an office and partially in a small conference room, and maybe I want a higher level of protection for a conference room. So how would I make this wall separate? I would go to the Modify tab, select the Split command, and then pick a point to split the wall, to make sure now that this enclosure of the conference room have a higher thickness, and here as well. So let's select that wall, and I'm going to edit type, and I already have this structure, so I'm starting with the structure I have, so I don't have to redo the entire structure and duplicate it. And the only additional thing I want to do here is I want to make it through ceiling. It's usually 6 inches above ceiling. And I want to make sure I change the name of the type. And also I want to assign it a different color. And usually when I pick colors, I go from lighter to darker, or I keep the coloring, so every wall, as it gets more complicated or it has a special assignment to it, the colors are relating. So in this case, I will start with the yellow and progress towards reds and purples with the more sound protection that each wall has. And you will provide additional description of each type in your document, but this is sufficient to define it as you're selecting them on the plan. Okay, so this is all I need to do. The structure is staying the same. I'm just changing the height. But by changing the type, I change the color here as well. and I want to make sure that now the wall actually gets higher, and it's 10 feet 6 inches, so it's going through the ceiling, it's not under the ceiling. And I'll assign the same type to all of the exterior small conference room walls. Now another type I might want to define is the division between the conference rooms and offices, and the conference rooms and between themselves. I might again want to have different types of the walls here on the two different sides of the office. So I'm going to once again use the split command and split off this wall. So you can see now they're separate. And here I would not have to do that because it's already split, it doesn't continue. So in this particular case for offices, I'm assuming the occupants are not making that much noise, so I'll just make that type 2. However, for the conference rooms, I want to separate them a little bit further and protect the insides on those sides. So I'm going to first start by selecting the walls I want to change, and I'm going to assign them type 2 again so I don't have to modify too much, and I'll edit type and duplicate it. Now I'm still going through ceiling, but the change I'm going to make is I'm going to, instead of each side, I'm going to make this a 3-layer wall. So there's going to be an extra layer on the inside, and rename this type 3. Don't forget to change the color. And now I need to add the structure. So here you have notation what's the exterior side and the interior side. Usually we put the extra layer on the interior side of the room. So I'm going to insert another layer. It's still a finish layer of gypsum board. And you'll note that now this is thicker than 5 inches. And the thickness is actually going to be reflected on a floor plan. You won't see it at the scale, but when you're starting to do clear dimensions of the rooms later on, this is going to be accounted for. Okay, that's all I wanted to do here. And the other thing, I also want to make sure I adjust my height, so these are again through ceiling. And we'll do that here as well. Same wall type 3. Now my large conference room might be a specialty conference room, and I might want to give it extra layer of protection. Maybe not on the outside, but definitely where it's partition between the offices, because privacy might be a big concern. So here again, I'm splitting up the wall. Just make sure it's continuous on the side you want to protect. And first, I'm going to assign the wall type to the exterior. So here I'm going to go type 3 and make sure to adjust my height so it's through ceiling, and then I'm going to start with type 3 and create a type 4 here. Now I'm still going through ceiling. I could go up to the deck if I wanted to, but what I'm going to do here, instead of 3 layers, I'm going to do 2 layers on each side. For additional acoustical protection, and this is my type 4. Again, don't forget the color. Getting darker into the browns here, and Again, one more layer. So you can continue building those layers, assign it a layer of plywood. Um, you note that there is exterior sheeting, plaster, and other options. You can duplicate the gypsum wall board to create cementitious board in case you have a high moisture level. So different ways to customize your walls. Just make sure you're accounting for thickness so you don't have to go back and do this later on when we start dimensioning our walls. And once again, this wall is now over 6 inches thick. And not forgetting the height. Again, these type of steps, they're not necessarily visible in your floor plan, but it's something that you want to account for early so you don't have to go back and fix it later. So we covered how to define the solid wall types. You would continue to define them in the same way, as many as you need. But what about the glazed types? So for what are called curtain walls in Revit, you would start with just a standard wall. But instead of using the basic or one of the generic walls, we would start with the curtain wall. And you can see that in my file I have some pretty fine things because of the existing shell that was drawn, but I'm just starting. This is the default as it would be defined in Revit. So let's edit this type to create something custom for a custom wall type for ourselves. So I'm going to duplicate it, and since I already have 4 different wall types, this is going to be my type 5. And for an office, I'll do 3/8 of an inch glazing. I'll do an aluminum frame, and let's do 1.5 inch by 5 inches. And this is going to be 8 feet high, so not all the way into the ceiling. And I'm putting it into ceiling height wall. Now the glazing is not going to change the height depending the wall I'm putting it into, but I'm defining it in my type just to remember what is going to be the difference between the types. I could put exactly the same curtain wall and just put it into a different wall, same way as I just changed the height of it between the type 1 and type 2, but I do want to define it as a separate type because I want to be able to color code it and tag it separately. So this is my type 5. I want to make sure this is interior. So in 3/8 glazing, actually the better way to call it, just to make sure that we're not calling this curtain wall, because that's not what it is in reality. Let's just call it glass storefront. Okay, and then I can do the different join conditions depending how I wanted to join my grid, but I won't have that much of a grid, so I'm not defining it here, and I'm not predefining my layout. If you wanted a certain type of spacing in your grid, you could build that into your curtain wall. What I do want to have is I want to have my mullions, the border mullions. I'm not going to do any intermediate ones, and I'm looking for 1.5 inch by 5 inches. Now if you don't have that as a default option, I'm going to show you how to modify the size and create custom mullions in the next step. Okay, one thing you'll note, there is no hatch because this is just glazing, so it will be thin and there's nothing to color. If I automatically embed this, it's going to cut the wall, which is what we typically want to see on the documentation floor plan. However, in the interest of color coding and continuing with the same color coding depending on the partition I'm embedding in, I'm not going to embed it at this point in time. We will come back to that and do this before we start the documentation later on. Okay, and don't forget the height, so always make sure your things are unconnected and 8 feet as defined in a name. And I'm getting the error message because I'm not embedding this wall, and you can see it's now the same color as the surrounding wall that I'm putting it into. So I'm going to make this typical for all of the offices. Now let's look at other things we can customize here. So I mentioned the mullions. So if you select the mullion, you always need to unpin it when you do that. I could change the size of the particular mullion, or if I wanted to create my own, let's say I want to create a 2-inch. Hopefully one of those doesn't already exist. So what I would do here, the thickness is still 5, but instead of having a 3/4 and 3/4 on each side, because the mullion is always defined at the center point, I would do 1 inch and 1 inch. As you can see, it got bigger and it's bigger than the other side. However, because I don't actually want to do that, I will put it back to my standard that comes with the wall. The other thing we can customize is the glass. As you can see, it's offset, which might be what you want, and as this you can actually flip it so it's inset on the inside edge or the outside edge. However, I do like to show them in a center unless I'm specifically customizing it this way. So I'm going to select my glazing panel, and let's see, I just want a standard glazed panel here, and as you can see, it's already centered. So here the offset is 0, and thickness we usually show it at 1 inch even if it's thinner than that because it's a nominal thickness was shown on a plan. But if you go to the panel that it originally had, the offset one, and we edit type, you can see that this one has an offset, so that's why it's not in the center, and again they're just 1 inch, and the material is defined here. So if I want to modify all of the walls and not just this one to have that center glaze panel, I'll go once again to my type, and under curtain panel I will define it as just a standard glazed panel, system panel, glazed right here. And you'll note that now they're all centered in a wall, even the other ones that I didn't select it because it's based on the type. If I want to put this exact same type of glazing in my small conference rooms, but in this particular case I don't want to embed it into this lower wall, remember this is ceiling height, but into a higher wall, I could use exactly the same wall type, so it's defaulting, but I'm going to edit it, and the only thing I'm changing is going to be the name. So this is type 6, and this is going to be through wall, so it's going to go through the grid, and the wall is already like this, so I don't actually need to change anything anywhere in the structure. I'm just going to click OK, and then apply my glazed wall in all of the locations. Make sure this doesn't happen accidentally, that the glazing is going across the face of another wall. You always want to stop just inside of the edge. And by disallowing join here, you can actually draw it in a couple of inches to allow space for a stud for the framing actually to happen on this corner. This is something you can clean up later on, but again, as everything else, it's good to do it as you're going along here. One thing I also wanted to note now that I'm zoomed in is we have all of these colors on a coarse setting. However, if you go to medium setting, you can actually see all of the layers of the wall. So now you can see that the inside of the conference room has two layers of chipboard, and how the glass is not actually fully embedded in, but we have chipboard going around it, and the transitions of all of the walls. So when we are defining and dimensioning and looking at the structure more closely, we're at the medium level. However, for color coding, we're going to stay on the coarse. So I went ahead and put the glazing into all of my little conference rooms. And again, you might need to disallow join to show this joint condition appropriately. The nice thing about non-embedded glazing is you can just copy it over onto other walls. Now let's say I wanted to do something really fancy with this particular room, and I wanted to have frameless glazed wall going around the conference room. Now I'm still keeping this partition, so the sound is going to be lesser here, and I'm embedding it this time around into a more significant wall that's through ceiling. So for that, we could once again start with our standard glaze that we already created. It's going to default to the most recent type, and let's edit. Now this is still going to be through ceiling, so through wall. Wall goes through ceiling. Let's actually call it through. I'm gonna keep it at the same height, but I'm getting rid of the aluminum frame. So I'm gonna call this frameless. Frameless still has a channel it's embedded in, and also because it's frameless and I want better sound protection, I'm making it half an inch, which will allow me to make it a laminated glass. And as always, make sure to adjust the type. Okay, and now I need to get rid of my mullions, so I want to have no mullions in order to create that frameless condition. One thing you might want to do here is then embed this door into the glass wall. So I'm going to get out of the wall command for a moment and get rid of this door, and then later on I'm going to import one into the storefront. Okay, so back to the wall command, type 7, I'm at 8 feet, and again leaving just a little bit of space to reinforce that frameless wall. And make sure that I'm running a chain here so I can turn the corner. And there we go. So I'm going to put a door. I think I had the door on this side. Because now there is glass here, it might be better to put the door against a solid wall. But one of the two things I want to do, I either want to leave a little piece of glass and then put the door inset, or I want to move in the whole glass. Remember, you need 4 inches clearance to clear your doorknob and all of the door hardware, just in case you remember that from the code class. So I'm going to pull it in. Here also I have 2 different wall thicknesses. So this is because I have the extra layer on one of these sides. So this might be something I need to deal with. And now the extra thickness is on the inside of the room, and I have a flush wall on the outside. So in order to place a door, I need to make sure that I have one imported in a file. So I'm just going to go and load the family. Now under doors, certain doors are labeled as curtain wall. So you have a single, you have double, you have some other options here. You can always create your own or download them, but make sure again you use a curtain wall type, because this acts as a curtain wall panel. So we're going to load one into the project just to make sure I have it as an option. Now if I just selected this panel, not to do that, it will turn the whole entire panel into which I'm having a hard time selecting. So it would turn the entire wall into a door. That's not what I want to do. What I want to do is I want to create a grid line. That's the width of my door. So standard door 3 feet. If you have frame and mullions on either side, make sure you account for the thickness of half of each one of those mullions. But I have a frameless condition. So I'm going to once again try to select here. I'm selecting the panel now. Unpin it. And now it's going to allow me to select that glazed door. And now I have a frameless glazed condition in this conference room with the door. I am covering it with the wall on top of it, just for the purposes of my color coding. Now really quickly I'm going to show you what happens if we change this curtain wall into an embedded. What this will do is it's going to get rid of our red, because now we're just seeing what's there at a floor level, which is just a thin piece of glass. And again, for documentation at the next step, this is exactly what we're going to do. But in the meanwhile, I'm going to undo this so we can color code the height of the wall on top of that curtain wall. So this is everything I have on the curtain walls as far as the wall types go. Now once we start elevating them, we can look at the glass panels and intermediate mullions and any additional details. And now that all of the wall types are defined, our last step is creating a legend. So going to the view and choosing a legend. So this is going to be wall type legend. And make sure the scale matches the scale of your floor plan. Now my floor plan here is an 1/8 inch, but if yours is in 16th or another scale, this is where you would adjust it. Okay, now going to annotate and using legend component, you can actually find your wall types. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, and 4. However, for the curtain wall type, you will not be able to place the curtain wall type because the mullion and the glass will not come with it, so it's not going to be visible. Also want to make sure you're using a floor plan, and you probably, based on your scale, want to do at least a 6 feet long section. If you're in a smaller scale like 16th inch, you might want to possibly even adjust that size. So you see the color shows up automatically. And if I turn off the thin lines that I turned on earlier, you'll see the thickness as well. Now before I space them, I want to make sure my text, so 3/32, our standard text size, will fit appropriately. So this is wall type 1, and this is all the text you will be including. So you will put the full definitions and what the wall types contain in your project, preliminary project description, your outline spec document. Okay, so let's make some copies here. And now by changing the selection, I will automatically change my color. And of course, making sure you change the names too. And double check all the colors are showing up appropriately, everything is checked correctly. Now what I'm going to do here, because all of these 3 wall types then have an option with the glazing in them, I'm going to copy this over. So this is going to be my type 5. And how I'm going to show the glazing is through detail lines, so just using a thin detail line. Thin lines. I'm going to represent the glazing. So here I have the mullion location. I'm going to make my window 4 feet. And my mullion thickness is 1.5 inches. And then the line for glass. For glass, you might not actually even have to do a double line because of its thickness. It will be barely perceptible based on the scale. And so this is what my wall type 5 is going to look like with the glazing. And I'm going to copy them over into the other wall types. Keep in mind our last one does not have mullions, so I will get rid of that second line, so it just has the opening. So this is the legend for my wall types, and looking forward to seeing what you come up with. Just make sure you place it on the sheet along with the floor plan.